So our session this morning is on thinking about the audience, audience awareness, and also how you can broaden the appeal of especially economic stories to reach a wider audience than you might otherwise. This has been kind of a continuing problem for business and financial journalists over the years. That goes way back. If you look at like the Wall Street Journal today, for instance, it reflects a bunch of changes that were made actually back around World War II by a very brilliant editor. His name was Bernie Kilgore. The Wall Street Journal back then was a very narrow newspaper that was kind of just about Wall Street, just about financial stuff. And he had the insight that business people would be interested in more general news and that they could sell more copies of the paper if they made it more attractive to other readers, people who weren't necessarily interested in stock prices or, economic data in and of itself. So the journal began adding feature stories on the front page, which they still have. So those go back a long way. And also adding some pieces that kind of brought business and economic analysis to other kinds of subjects. And that's become a trend across business journalism in general. This piece we're going to look at first, in the Washington Post is part of the website Wonk blog, which is part of the Washington Post's overall website. And it basically produces articles that are kind of designed for just that reason, to appeal to people who are interested in policy, who are interested in the overall state of civil society, and want to read things that are a little more insightful about economics. And one of the facts about business and economic journalism is that your readership is probably the highest when there's something bad going on. When the markets go down, when prices are rising, when some, catastrophe has happened in the markets, then a lot of people start looking at the business section or at the business part of the website who might not normally. So it's kind of an opportunity in those situations to broaden your readership and to, attract some other people. This article, I think, is an example of a publication trying to do that. There's been a lot of volatility in the markets over the last several weeks. This one is just from 10 days, just 2 weeks ago, and it followed a very choppy period in the markets where the markets were going down like several percentage points and up, mostly because people were uncertain about the future conduct of the Federal Reserve. When I looked at this story, I looked around for a few that kind of exemplified the things I want to talk to this morning about broadening your base. And this one seemed like a good example. It seems when you read the beginning of the story that they're trying to make it very accessible to the non-specialist. The history. See, now he's actually got the background. So if somebody actually got past that intervening, they could now sort of see what he's talking about. And I think this is mostly successful in doing, what you said, trying to reach that person who has an interest in some background or some understanding of the terms. You were saying before, if the economy is growing like 1.8%, it wouldn't be like necessarily, how do you make a big story out of that, right? I mean, think about it. So, like, one way to do that would be to say, what is the long-term impact of 1.5% growth? How does it compare to average growth over the long term for other countries? And sort of do some sort of scenarios where you maybe call up an economist and say, okay, what if the economy grew at this rate for the next 5 years? Where would we be in 5 years? And it may be actually better news than it sounds like, because most growth in the U.S. has been anywhere from like 2 to 4% per year in inflation-adjusted terms for decades. And so when it's 4%, things are going very well. When it's going 2%, that's maybe enough to just keep the economy growing, create enough jobs. In the last several years, the growth has been pretty low, like 1.5, 2%, not enough to provide enough jobs to keep the economy robust. So there's sometimes a way you can think of framing a story where, so the headline for that might be, 1.8% growth sounds bad, but it's actually good. I don't know. We have to test this out. I'm just making this up at the moment. But there might be a story like that where you could arrive at a conclusion just from looking at the data and asking questions of a couple of economists. That might give you a fresh outlook. When I started as a banking reporter, I got interested in it because because I was writing about the Federal Reserve, and which involves monetary economics. So I had to kind of learn on the job. And as I said, when it's one of the great things about being a reporter is that you can call anybody up. You can call up famous economists. You have a reason to do that, and sort of educate yourself. The trick I learned was to sort of find people, to find economists who were knowledgeable, who understood the issues, who maybe weren't famous, but had some interest of their own in getting their name in the paper. I don't know if that translates into this market, but in building relationships, I would go to economics conferences, where economists meet and talk about things. These things can be very, very dull. It's like, and I don't know, it's probably the same way here. They're also, it's a very peculiar subculture. Economists will meet and they will put a paper up, like an academic paper one of them is written, and the professor will present it, and then the next professor will get up and say, I think this article is utter garbage. The author has made several simple mistakes that I would not have done, and they'll have these vicious arguments, and they're all like friends. It's the funniest thing. But they attack each other like that. It's kind of a Socratic, method of arguing back and forth. And it's interesting to attend those things because you start to get more of an insight into, what their issues are and how they think about things. And if you actually go to them and listen and ask questions, I think that can build some trust on their part that you're actually interested in the subject. And then you can, you know who they are, what the issues are. So then you can call them up a month later and say, hi, this is Elena. You met me at the blah blah conference. I'm trying to figure out what the latest IMF communique means. And again, you can establish ground rules. You can say, just talk to me about it. If I want to quote you, I'll call you back and tell you what I want to say. That's one sort of strategy for building relationships with economists. Does that sound feasible to you guys, or does that sound crazy? Yeah. I found it worked. I'll give you an example. In 1987, there was a big stock market crash in the U.S. The Dow Jones went down 20% in a day. I wrote a big article about it, or a couple of articles about it for Fortune. The guy who was the Wall Street reporter was out writing a book, so I was the next guy in line, so they had me do it. And it was a very volatile time in the 1980s. There had been a couple of recessions, and this stock market crash was based mostly on computer problems, it turned out. They had just invented computerized trading. Nobody really understood it very well, and there was some sort of unsettling in the global markets. And one day, all of a sudden, the people using computers to trade kind of went berserk, and they just started selling everything. And it was a Monday, so it was Black Monday, of course, or Black Tuesday, I can't remember. And I was writing about this and trying to find new angles. And I'd been to a conference a couple of months before that where I met an academic named Robert Schiller, who was from Yale. And it was a very dry conference. He was talking about like uncertainty and risk, which is like a big, academic debate in economics. And I remembered he'd been talking about the way investors behave, and that he was doing surveys about them. So I thought, well, I'll call this guy up and see if he has any ideas, And I called him up, and it turned out that he had actually done a survey during the crash. He had a survey out among investors where he was asking them other questions. And when the crash happened, he sent them updates and said, what were you thinking this morning? And then this afternoon, and he had great stuff. It was like, and the insight from it was that there wasn't any real outside reason for the crash. It was mostly just a matter of psychology. That what people were thinking about when the market was going down was how much it had gone down the day before. They weren't thinking about the economy. They weren't thinking about the global markets. They were just reacting. And so he not only had this insight, he had data. It was like, 62% of the traders surveyed that morning said X, so it was a great article. So, the big debate in the U.S. for the last several years, and in some ways the last several decades, has been what to do about healthcare insurance. The U.S. is like the only advanced industrial economy that doesn't have guaranteed healthcare. I'm a freelancer now, right? I pay out of pocket, after tax, $1,800 a month for health insurance. So like over $20,000 a year. During World War II, when the economy was under great stress, the U.S. was building 300 airplanes a day, and ships, and they imposed price and wage controls throughout the economy in the U.S. so that people wouldn't sort of try to profit from the war. So if you were running a company, you couldn't give people salary increases. It was against the law. You could go to jail. It was like very draconian. Companies, being very clever, thought of ways that they could still reward their employees without breaking the law. So one of the ways they found was they could give them benefits. And at the time, healthcare insurance was kind of a new thing. You could take out a policy, that would cover your doctor visits or your hospital bills. Up till then, people just paid, out of their pocket. There wasn't any government program or anything else. So companies started offering healthcare insurance as a benefit, and by the end of the war, it would become very popular. One of my editors at Fortune would always say, at Fortune, it was a bi-weekly magazine. It came in every 2 weeks, and there were 35 writers and 25 reporters. And when you were a reporter trying to become a writer and you wanted to write a story, you had to write a formal memo to the story planning committee. That was the memo would say, to the story planning committee from Rob Norton. And on one page, you had to describe the article you wanted to do. And then every 2 weeks, they'd have a meeting where the top editor would sit at the head of this giant table, 30 feet long, and all the other editors would be on either side. And if you had suggested an article, you were allowed to come to the meeting. And he would pick up yours and often say so we have Rob here. That's how he talked. He'd say, he wants to do a story about healthcare. I think this is boring. Does anyone agree? And no one would say anything. He'd put it down like that. He'd go to the next one. It was very disheartening. But then every now and then they would approve one, and it would be wow. He would always say, if you didn't address this in your story memo, he would say, why do I want to read about this now? Exactly what you said. And so you had to think about that. What is your, and this gets back to the topics we were talking about yesterday in terms of ideation or story ideas. Timeliness is always an issue. You need to, and so that's a very good question to ask. Why read about this now? And I think, I'm guessing, I think his argument here would be that, that the problems with the healthcare system, are in the news. There's still a lot of debate about which way the national program should go, and that this example here add some insight. And I think probably specifically he would say this, the fact that I think the news event here, to the extent there is one, is that this experiment just passed its second anniversary or something. Yeah, 2 weeks ago. See, here's where, to the extent there is a news peg here, that's what we call it, a news peg. Something you hang something on. It's called a news peg. To the extent there's a news peg, this is it. 2 weeks ago, they reported the data from the first 2 years of the study. So here's why he's telling you. So if he were doing this more as a straight news story, he would have started with that. He would, you would write this, researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology analyzing data from the Oregon healthcare system announced last week the results of a 2-year survey. That would be something like that, something more elegant than that, but that would be your lead, And then it would be more evident why. And you could still say, it's interesting, it's not interesting, So in the end, he does sort of bring it back to the universal point, or the more macro point for the U.S., and talks about the way programs can be improved, and sort of gives this person some opportunity to make their little speech, and and ends on a nice note. So yeah, this is this is an individualistic approach that he's taking in this story, and I think I think people would agree, most people anyway, that it's largely successful. Although there's certainly other ways you could have done it. Any other thoughts on the story? Yes. Yeah, I think his intention here was just to sort of make this interesting case for a wider audience, because people in other states. This was probably covered in some detail in the Oregon papers. Are there any papers left in Oregon? Just kidding. This is one of the problems in the U.S. is the fall of the regional newspapers has been a real problem. We used to have very strong regional newspapers in the U.S., or at least maybe a dozen, I don't know, or between 1 and 2 dozen papers in cities like Providence, Rhode Island, Jacksonville, Florida, and a lot of them have really cut back on their coverage or don't exist anymore. So anyway, this study was probably got a lot of attention. It was probably on local TV, even in this state. But if you lived in another state, you might not have heard about it, like certainly if you were in New York or Washington. This is a very narrow subject, right? This is like one city in the U.S. It's Washington, D.C., so it's the city he lives in, more or less. It touches on what's actually a very big problem in overall health in the U.S., and it sort of gets into a little area of economics that's sometimes overlooked. Basically the way that taxes affect incentives in specific markets, and I think this is an example of somebody. So he writes an economic. At this point, he was writing this economic scene column. I think probably was it twice a week they write that? At least once a week. I think it might have been twice a week. He was very prolific. So he's writing a lot of stories, and his subject is economics and sort of making economics interesting to the broader readership of the Times. That's the whole reason they have this column. They've played around with this a lot. In the past, they used to have economists write this. And for many years, they would have like a pair of economists, one sort of on the left and one sort of on the right, or at least a little bit, would take turns writing it. With him, they appointed a journalist to do it. I know because I actually interviewed for this job like 10 years before this, so I got to hear what their insights were about it. The reason for that is traditional and mechanical. It's in the old days before computer composition of newspapers, you wouldn't know the shape of the headline until the article was actually set in type. And then you would know how much room there was, how many characters there would be. So you couldn't write a headline ahead of time because you wouldn't know whether it was too long or too short. And it's an artistic thing. Like, you can't have too much white space, you can't have the letters too crowded. So writing the headline would be the last thing that was done, usually by the copy editor, the sub-editor, or there was a specialist, on the copy desk, depending on how big the newspaper was, who would, write the headlines at that point. And it was it's a skill, writing headlines. It's a very distinct little skill. Like the guy who was running Fortune when I was there was like a genius at writing. John Huey was his name. He was like a fearsome headline writer. And I'll tell you one little story about headlines. So Fortune in 1984 started publishing a special edition in the summer called the Annual Investor's Guide, or Retirement Guide. The Annual Retirement Guide. It was just a big fat magazine with like 20 articles about retiring. And someone mentioned the other day that there are some subjects that are evergreen, that never change, Well, personal investing and retirement is one of those subjects. You pick up something that's written 20 years ago, it sounds exactly like it was written last week, How many ways can you tell people to save more, to put their money in different investments, So it was a big deal, though, because it was a special issue, and it tended to be very popular. So a lot of thought went into the cover line for the issue. Like, what are we going to say on the cover of the Annual Retirement Guide? And, we would have these battles, 2-hour-long meetings and look at like 35 different possible things. And, we knew the picture was going to be like a beach chair with a palm tree and a cocktail glass and like a little leather, luxury, retirement. And one guy, not me, a guy named Eric Schoenberg, who was later the editor of People, came up with the best cover line ever for the Retirement Guide, and that was "Retire Rich," 2 words. And so there was this picture of this beach scene, with a folded up newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, and the drink, and then just the words "Retire Rich." And then you'd have a little strip of, subheads on the left, like, how to maximize your 401k, how not to pay too much taxes. There was a long tradition in print journalism of writing kind of artsy headlines, where, the article would be about some legislative decision, and the headline would be, "To be or not to be, ?" And then the subhead would be like, the battle about the retirement bill, heats up in the Colorado legislature, right? And like you say, on paper, you see the headline, you see the deck, you see the picture, you have a pretty good idea what the story is about. Online, that means nothing, It's like, oh, okay, there's an article about Shakespeare, right? Or something, And but those old habits die hard. But you're right. You need to write headlines a very specific way for